There are lots of misconceptions about teaching grammar. There are also opinions about whether or not there's a place for teaching grammar in a proficiency-based classroom. Well, in this episode, Catherine Ritz and Mike Travers, who are the authors of Proficiency-Based Instruction, Teaching Grammar for Proficiency, join me to talk about the place of grammar in a proficiency-based classroom. And yes, there is a place for it. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, as you hear every time I start the podcast, that you are an incredible language teacher because you're taking time out of your week to listen to teachers talk about language teaching. That's what makes you such an incredibly dedicated teacher. So thank you so much for doing that. And you likely clicked on this episode today because once again, you saw the word, and when teachers talk about grammar, we have lots to talk about. So I invited on today Mike Travers and Catherine Ritz, who have recently published a book through Actful, and it is called Proficiency-Based Instruction, Teaching Grammar for Proficiency. And this is the second in a series. The first book in the series in 2022 was Proficiency-Based Instruction, Input and Interaction in World Language Education that Catherine Ritz published along with Christina Toro. Catherine Ritz is also a clinical associate professor at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, and she serves as the program director for curriculum and teaching and world language education. So along with Catherine, I will be speaking with Mike Travers, a Spanish teacher at Wellesley High School in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and he also serves as the leader of the curriculum team in the high school. So together, they co-authored this book. And if you have been listening to the podcast for a while, these two individuals are OGs of the podcast. So we are way up close to 200 episodes, but way back in the beginning, Mike Travers was with me on episode 9. And then Catherine Ritz was with me on episode 21. And we originally talked about unpacking the 5 C's. And when I talked with Mike, we talked about grammar and using the PACE model. That was like 3 years ago. So we've had a lot going on since then, and you may have seen them at Actful and Nectful and MAFLA, which is our state organization. We're all in Massachusetts, and also at AETF. But we have a lot to talk about when it comes to grammar and proficiency. So we are going to look at grammar through a proficiency lens today, and then pulling from a lot of the information in their book, we're going to talk about teaching grammar for proficiency. So let's jump in and welcome to the podcast, Catherine and Mike.
Hello. Super excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Yes. Who's not excited to talk about grammar? Come on.
It's our favorite topic.
Right? Yes. I remember on the last episode that I spoke with Mike, our topic was resistance to change. And so I remember he was joking. He said, why do I always get like resistance to change in grammar, all of these divisive topics and everything? The fun things, right? I hope teachers will not see grammar as a divisive topic after our conversation today and after they spend some time in your book. So let's jump right in. And so I'm going to start with you, Mike. Now, many teachers struggle with finding that right balance between grammar instruction and proficiency-based teaching. And I would imagine there are a lot of misconceptions that teachers have. You know, there are things they hear, things they assume. So what do you often hear about teaching grammar, and how do you address them? And particularly, how do you address them in the book?
So it's funny. When I first started learning about proficiency-based teaching, the first thing I ever heard was grammar is bad. Grammar became this swear word. I don't know what it was. You'd go to conferences and people would bring it up and they'd be like, no, we don't talk about that. We can't say that. We can't talk about grammar. And through my own research, through the Actful guiding principles, through a bunch of different things, like the realization has kind of come to fruition that grammar is not a bad word. And we still need grammar in proficiency-based teaching. In proficiency-based instruction, we need to have grammar, because without grammar, we don't have a language. Mm-hmm. We don't have structure. We don't have anything behind it. Mm-hmm. And I would just love to find where this sort of misconception even ever came from. I think it's an overcorrection, because we're so used to the old drill and kill, where it was grammar all day, every day. It's verb charts for days, right? But thinking about it, it's not getting rid of grammar. And I think that's what's scary for people too, when they get ready to adopt proficiency-based teaching and proficiency-based models, right? Mm-hmm. They think, well, grammar is why I became a language teacher. I love grammar. I could do the imperfect subjunctive in my sleep. But the reality is we're not getting rid of it. And what we say in the book is we say, you're not getting a divorce from grammar. You're redefining your relationship with it. Mm-hmm. And so what we're saying is, yeah, grammar used to be the focus. We used to go into units and say, all right, we're going to start the subjunctive unit. It's time for us to start the past tenses unit. And instead of starting it that way, now we're saying, all right, let's use grammar as a way to support talking about something that we actually want to talk about, the kids actually are interested in doing. And so it's a huge misconception that's out there. And it's also a nice point of sort of almost like a relieving moment for teachers to realize, like, okay, you're not asking me to get rid of grammar. That's not the message, and that should never be the message that's out there. And so that might help ease some anxiety as we move into what we're going to talk about today.
And so, Catherine, I will ask you a little bit more on this same topic when it comes to research. And anybody who picks up your book is going to say, wow, these people spend their lives reading research and doing research. There's so many studies cited in your book. So I know you have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this. But teachers will often ask me when I'm talking about this topic, like, is there research that shows that this proficiency-based way of going about teaching, in the end, students are able to speak better and acquire language better? So are there some studies out there that you can reference?
Yeah, so I think this might get at another misconception around teaching grammar that I'll speak from my own experience. I remember going through this when I started. My background's teaching French and Spanish. And when I started out as a teacher, I was given a textbook and it's a grammar-based curriculum. And so I think a misconception there is you're like, well, hey, wait a minute. Like, this approach worked for me. So I started learning French when I was in 7th grade, and I experienced a more traditional grammar-based approach to learning French. And then I added Spanish in high school. So it worked for me. Why can't this approach work for my students? Like, why am I even being asked to change in the first place, right? So what's the evidence that this is actually like a better way to support language learning when it worked for me? And I would say we need to just acknowledge that we have chosen, if you're listening to this podcast, you chose a career as a language teacher. You are the exception to the rule. So I'm not bragging. I think all of us on this call and anyone listening, if you're a language teacher, you're a good language learner, right? You're the exception. I was going to learn French. There was nothing that was going to stop me from learning French. No matter what approach was presented to me, I was going to learn French. But what about the rest of the kids in the class? So, and you might look today, like in my class, I've got the kids that do really well in this and whatever. And there are some kids that are going to succeed kind of no matter what. They're the exception to the rule. But for the majority of students, this approach, the grammar-driven approach, has not been successful. So I think first, to get back to your question on the research, there needs to be more rigorous studies. I'd love to see more attention to learner outcomes with different models. So I do think there needs to be more research done. But we do have studies that support that a proficiency-based, communicative approach is more effective. So I'll cite one that was done in Europe from Dalton Puffer in 2008 that looked at more of a content-based approach. So that's a form of communicative language teaching that's more proficiency-driven. And they looked at different kinds of learners that had different aptitudes. So the exceptional language learners, so you and me and everyone listening, they did well. So they compared a more traditional type of a program to this more content-based, communicative, proficiency-driven program. The good language learners did well no matter what. So either way, they did well. But importantly, the sort of average language learners in the more content-driven, communicative approach did better. right? So more learners were like lifted and succeeded in that approach compared to the traditional grammar-driven approach. And I think that needs to be our focus. Like, we want everyone to succeed. There's so much attention in supporting all learners. And yet we're sort of holding on to an approach that we know does not support all language learners. We need to look at who's staying in our programs when it's no longer required. What are kids saying? How are they describing themselves as language learners? Do they think they're good language learners? Which kids, right? So like, I would just ask us to sort of reflect on that a little bit. I think that is a big misconception that might be holding a lot of teachers back from maybe embracing some new practices that could really benefit so many more learners.
Right. I was thinking of Stephen Krashen's compelling input hypothesis. And when you were saying, we as language teachers, we love learning language. So we ended up seeking out all of those compelling topics in the language, even though the teachers weren't doing it, and so if you weren't doing that, would you have acquired the language? So thank you very much for that perspective. So, Mike, I'm going to come back to you and start looking in the classroom at what this looks like. So when we talk about teaching grammar in a way that truly supports communication and proficiency, rather than just those drill and kill memorization things. So what does it look like to teach grammar in that way in the classroom?
This is an exciting part because some teachers love the research. I'm one of the ones that loves the research and the background behind it all. But realistically, you just want to know what you got to do. You want to know what lessons look like, right? So interestingly enough, when it comes to what your lessons look like or what it looks like to teach grammar for proficiency, the first step is honestly putting the grammar aside for a moment. So throughout our book, in the beginning part, it's kind of interesting because we say, hold off on the grammar. The grammar's coming. It's coming. It's coming. And it kind of feels like you're talking to a little kid that you just keep telling them, like, just wait 5 more minutes. Just wait 5 more minutes. But what we do is we talk about how the first thing we're going to do with learners is build these sort of form-meaning connections. And so through a lot of interpretive activities, the interpretive mode is our best friend when we start thinking about how to present grammar in context. And a lot of that involves just using either authentic resources, teacher-created resources that just get at kids understanding what they're reading or what they're listening to before you jump into the grammar. Because in the traditional model, we explain the grammar first, and then you use it, and then maybe along the way you might listen to it or hear it. But here it's, all right, let's put this in an authentic context. Let's put this for a reason. Let's talk about something within our unit, and then eventually get down the road to it. So I know, like in the first episode we were on together, Joshua, we talked about the PACE model, and there's tons of stuff about the PACE model in the book, where basically you present the grammar, and then in separate lessons you draw attention to it, and that's that final moment when the teacher can finally be like, all right, here comes the grammar, but it's not the same as what you would have expected from before. So when we finally do get to that grammar, after we spend a long time with a resource, after we spend a long time with providing comprehensible input and putting that grammar in a context for kids, we draw their attention to it, and then we put it back on them. And I think that's the most fun part of all of this, is putting it back on the students to start to talk about what they notice, to start to talk about patterns that they're picking up on. And so kind of putting them in the driver's seat, so to speak, so that it's not always us explaining the rules. It's them internalizing, them telling us what the rules look like, and us becoming almost like coaches on the side. We're guiding them to that place of helping them realize what this grammar could possibly be. And then later on, we become kind of activity designers, where we'll start to create these activities where they're actually outputting and using the language, because that's what kids want. Like, no kid usually comes to the language class and is like, oh, I can't wait to read an article, and I hope there's a new grammar tense in there. They read it about something interesting, and hopefully get them to the place of actually talking about something interesting using that grammar.
So you had started by saying you put the grammar aside and you come back to it. So if we dive a little deeper into your classroom, when you're choosing that grammar, because you do have to choose some structure that you're going to focus on, are you choosing that structure and then finding the resource that supports learning that structure? Or do you find the resource that you want to use with students and then figure out the grammar they need to understand that resource? So it's like a cart before the horse, chicken and the egg thing. So talk us through that process for you.
I would actually go a few steps further back than where you even started. I would start with talking about what is the goal for my language class, or what's the goal for that unit in particular. Starting with the end in mind and thinking about, I want them to be able to do this thing. What's my sort of performance objective, as we call it in the book? Like talking about, I want them to have a conversation about this. I want you to be able to debate about this. I want you to be able to compare and contrast these things, and thinking about what assessments I want them to be able to do, and what language functions. Language functions are basically usage of everyday language. What language functions support that? And then through all of that, I come to the grammar point. And then, so to your point of like, all right, grammar before resource, resource before grammar. At that point, I would say grammar before resource. And then come to that place where we actually talk about this a lot too, is either finding a resource that exists as an authentic resource, or sometimes writing your own resource, depending on, different contexts and things like that, what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. So for anyone listening who is now wondering, what does he mean by a language function? Can you just unpack so we understand what that is?
Yeah. Language function, it sounds so fancy schmancy, doesn't it? Like everybody gets so intimidated by it. Language function is just an everyday use of language. How do people actually use the language? So there are things like explaining and describing and comparing, but they can also be interpretive in terms of things like identifying and choosing. So just everyday ways people interact with the language.
Mm-hmm.
So, Catherine, I will come to you for this question because I want to go a little further with this, because these are the questions where, okay, I want to try this out, but then I have to document what I'm teaching and we have curriculum. So in a proficiency-based vertical curriculum, so you have your department and you have your level 1, your level 2, whatever you're naming them. So in that vertical curriculum, how or should you put grammar into the curriculum? And if so, is there a certain order that would maybe mimic what a textbook does? So talk us through what that vertical curriculum would look like, and if we should have grammar in there.
We need to appreciate the fact that for better or worse, we have what's been called a de facto national curriculum for world language learning. So my background's teaching French and Spanish. So I guarantee any French or Spanish teacher, and probably other languages as well that you talk to, knows what that grammatical syllabus is. So level 1, we're going to do the present tense. We're going to do articles, definite articles, etc. Level 2, we all know what's coming. We're going to do the past tense, preterite versus imperfect. Level 3, we know we're hitting them with the subjunctive and the conditional and the future antérieur and whatever else is coming their way. So like this, and any textbook, like I can almost guarantee, and I've looked at newer ones today, you find the same grammatical syllabus. So although we don't have an official national curriculum for world languages, right, there is a de facto one, and it's a grammatical syllabus. So the challenge, I think, that we're struggling with and like needs more attention is that syllabus, that grammatical syllabus, does not align with realistic proficiency expectations for learners. So think about a year 1 curriculum. Let's say a typical level 1 class at the high school or middle school. We can reasonably expect learners to achieve a novice high proficiency level, which means that they can sometimes, but not all of the time, use simple sentences, ask simple questions, and give simple descriptions. So most of the time, but not all of the time. Then in level 2, we're like, hey, let's throw this past tense with you, and you're going to now start narrating in the past. Well, guess what proficiency level that is? That's not intermediate, that's advanced. So kids have not yet even achieved an intermediate low proficiency level, and we're requiring them to do advanced level performances. This does not align. So it is not reasonable for any learner, given 1 year of instruction, to all of a sudden be able to achieve an advanced proficiency level. Advanced low in a good K-12 program is your strongest outcome at the very end of the program, right? When kids do AP, that's your like highest outcome. So in year 2, we shouldn't be asking our kids to do past narration. They're not ready for it. So we shouldn't be surprised that they're like, oh my God, I'm a bad language learner. This is super hard. I can't do this. Like, surprise, surprise. Of course they can't. So we really need to look critically at this. Should I be articulating grammar in my curriculum design? Yes, absolutely. But we need to be really thoughtful about this. And I think that's where starting with realistic proficiency and performance expectations comes into play. So just to take that year 2 example, rather than having this past narration. So what Mike was saying, you're going to start with, how do I want them communicating? What's an engaging topic, and what are the functions of language? Do I want them describing things? Do I want them asking and answering questions? On what topic? On what theme? What would be meaningful for these kids? And then backing into the language structures or the grammar that makes sense for that. So in a year 2, where they're coming in maybe novice high, I really want to give them time to get comfortable as an intermediate. And intermediate, it's sentence level discourse. It's simple sentences or connected sentences. You're just building their vocabulary bank. I think the order that is embedded in our mind of the grammar is really like a false. I don't know when or who came up with that order, but I think we just assume that that's the right way because it's always been done that way. Mm-hmm. And I really think we need to challenge that and push back because it's not serving our kids.
In terms of writing our curriculum, we're documenting our curriculum. So say it's our level 1 high school Spanish 1 class. Yeah. And we are documenting the curriculum in terms of what are the topics that are covered, maybe vocabulary blocks or themes, if you're looking at AP themes or something. So if we are putting grammatical aspects in there, would you name it sort of ER verbs, AR verbs, present tense conjugations, or would you do it more so in terms of language functions?
I would start with the function. How do I want them to communicate? I want them describing, asking questions, all of those things. And then I would name it. That's where grammar is not a bad word, right? Yes. There is a place for grammar in a proficiency-based approach. Yes. The research also supports that learners need attention to form. It's not no grammar like in first language acquisition. This is a difference from first to second language acquisition. So I do think that you need to name it, but you might, rather than just, all the ER verbs, maybe we're identifying which ones are significant, how they're using. So I like to write curriculum where you not just have a grammar topic like preterite, but where you give examples of how it's used in a context.
So I'm thinking now you're getting the wheels turning with me in terms of how I'm writing my own curriculum and my vertical curriculum, which I've been so proud of. And now I'm thinking, wow, I need to change some stuff, which is great. That's why we have these conversations.
Always change.
So, right? So I'm thinking now that if you start with the function, then it almost dictates the grammar that's needed. But if you start with the grammar and you try to come up with a function, it's backwards.
Mike talks a lot about a grammatical mismatch, this misalignment where you're sort of shoehorning in a communicative topic with a grammar point that doesn't quite fit.
So I like to kind of challenge the notion of thinking when we start to think about, especially on like a level 1 course, right? When we think about saying only ER verbs, well, I want to think about the language you teach, and I want to give you a performance assessment where you can only talk in ER verbs. Well, what happens if you want to use an IR verb, or let's say Spanish, you want to do an AR verb? No, you can't do that. So I get kind of nervous when we start to talk about specifying so specifically what kind of verb we're doing. We're only doing stem changing verbs, right? It starts to really pigeonhole you into only doing certain kinds of tasks and only using certain language at those points. And so what I like to think about instead is thinking about what subject pronouns do you actually need in general for those verbs. So think about your unit, like think of a level 1 unit. If you're in a school, if you're talking about school, you might talk about yourself and what you do in your classes. And let's say your performance task is asking questions. Well, then you need the you forms of whatever those verbs are. Then let's say you have a unit later on throughout the year where you're talking about family and what family means to you. Well, in that unit, you're going to maybe go back to talking about yourself. You might talk about one person singular. You might talk about plural. You might use we. And so slowly throughout your curriculum, you're adding all of those forms instead of starting with the 6 boxes that we're all used to doing and doing all 6 pronouns. Because another one of my favorite things to think about is trying to come up with a performance assessment or any real human context where I need to talk about what I do, what you do, what he, she, or they do, talking about what we do, you all do, possibly in Spain, possibly not in Spain, possibly being, polite in France. And they, like, finding one of those particular types of topics would be near impossible, and if not just strange to end up doing. So thinking about the curriculum piece, specifying verb types, maybe not so much, specifying the subject pronouns you want to focus on and changing it. So, all right, we're looking at these letters. When I add these letters to verbs, it makes this difference. It means this particular thing.
So it's interesting what I noticed when you were talking about that. You referred to a performance assessment. Now, your book is titled Proficiency-Based Instruction. So, Catherine, let's unpack that a little bit. So, if we're teaching in a proficiency-based environment in our classroom, but we're giving performance assessments. So, for those of us that might need some distinction between both of them and what we should be doing, can you just give us some insight on that?
Yes. So we do really try to simplify it, but I admit at first glance, it's like, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about proficiency, what's performance? But so proficiency is kind of how learners can use language out on their own independently in the real world. Performance is what's happening in our classroom where we are scaffolding and supporting learners. So the performance, and then where they're doing performances on different topics. So if I have a theme around healthy or nutrition or whatever, a theme on something around clothing or something around whatever topic you want to throw out there. They're doing performances on those topics that I'm scaffolding and supporting. They're learning the vocabulary and the structures on that topic. That contributes to their proficiency development. So I said before, like a first year course, typical level 1 course, you might expect at the end of the year, learners would achieve a novice high proficiency target. So on their own, they should be able to, most of the time, but not all of the time, use simple sentences and give simple descriptions and so on. So, well, how do we get them there? How do we get them to do that independently? In the classroom, we should be scaffolding and supporting them to achieve, I would just say, intermediate performance. I think where it's been confusing, if you're trying to target, I'm shooting for novice high, let me try to target intermediate low. I think that's confusing. So I would just say, get kids to do something intermediate. Simple sentences, simple questions, simple descriptions, and so on. That's what intermediates can do. So in my classroom, I'm really inviting kids to engage in intermediate performances, whether that's a classroom task or a performance assessment. And we do give examples of many examples of both of those in the book, but that's what's going to help them move up. A red flag in the first year class for me is always when you just see sort of novice level, so word level, let's just look at lists of words and so on. And they don't really see or get exposed to how to use those words in a sentence, right?
I'm looking at the assessments we do in our classroom. As much as we talk about proficiency, the vast majority, if not all of our assessments in the classroom are performance assessments, and
Correct.
They're not assessments for proficiency. Is that
Yes.
correct?
So in the classroom, we are not doing, even though we are doing proficiency-based instruction, our assessment, everything we're doing in the classroom to support proficiency development is a performance, right? We are doing performance tasks in terms of our classroom activities, and we are doing performance assessments in terms of sort of how we're gauging learner progress.
So I'm thinking back to last year, whenever students start taking the Apple, which is a proficiency assessment, right? And I start seeing teachers put things on Twitter, X, whatever, where they're saying, oh, my students are always, performing at this level in the classroom. And then they took the Apple test and their scores were so much lower than I was expecting. So essentially, that is what should be happening.
Yeah, I remember going to a MOPI training, the Modified Oral Proficiency interview, which I would highly recommend to anyone if you really want to get a good sense of the proficiency levels. But the teacher who was there, volunteered to have her students interviewed. And the person running the workshop after the student left was like, this student's a novice high. And she was, I think, a little upset, like, hey, wait a minute, this kid's been doing great. Like, he's at least intermediate mid. And you're absolutely right. In the classroom, because you're giving them structures, you're giving them sentence frames and sentence starters, which is, by the way, a way to help support grammar acquisition. You're giving them all of this. And of course, they're going to, and they've been learning on this topic. They've been practicing this of course, they're going to perform higher than they would on this proficiency assessment, which is what an OPI is, where they don't know what they're going to be asked, right?
So that we when we get those scores back, they
take heart.
are yes, take heart, right? So it's funny that whenever I like towards the end of the school year when students are taking it, I see those comments come out all the time in Facebook groups in different areas. And when I was reading your book, you made it a point several times. You explained it first, then as you presented different activities in the book, you would say, remember that this is the performance target, but the proficiency target is actually lower than that. And the more that you did that, it started to solidify with me. And I was thinking back to everything those teachers were writing about. Yeah. So, Mike, let's stay in the classroom with those very specific types of activities that we could be doing. I think we spent enough time in the theory world. So, teachers, if you're still listening, thanks for holding on. You know, you got a bunch of people who love the theory and all this stuff. So, we talked about it. But, Mike, can you share an example of an activity or a strategy that you've used in the classroom? And there are lots in the book you can even pull from that really integrate grammar while keeping communication at the center of the learning?
Absolutely. I think Catherine and I have two favorite chapters, and I think it's towards the end. My personal favorite is when we start talking about output. We start talking about learner output, because there is the misconception out there that, you know, we don't need output. We do need output. Output is how learners can check to see that they actually are grasping the concepts we're providing to them in the input, right? And so during one of our chapters, what we talk about is how to scaffold that, so that the output tasks that we're doing with our learners look different throughout our unit. Because what we're expecting kids to do in the beginning of a unit should look different than what we're doing in the middle of a unit, and should look different than what we're doing at the end of a unit. And so what we ended up kind of calling them were early unit, mid unit, and end of unit output tasks. And so as the units kind of go on, what we talked about was in the beginning, when we first ask kids to do some sorts of output with the language, it's highly scaffolded. We are providing sentence frames galore. We are providing chat mats. We are providing all sorts of structure for them. And we're just helping them kind of get through the language and get through the tasks themselves. But as the unit progresses, we start to build student agency, meaning that we're trying to get kids to actually own the grammar, so that it's not always us that has to own the grammar. So we're starting to get them to be more independent. And so we start to change the way we're providing scaffolds. We provide optional scaffolds, and we're providing moments for feedback for kids to realize, like, oh, I'm relying too much on that expressions list. I'm relying too much on this verb part that we're working on here. And ultimately, at the end of a unit, we get to the place where we say, independently, what can you actually do? Here's the task. So let me give you an example. This is one I'm just kind of thinking through that I've done recently in my classes. So, because I also want to choose like a somewhat upper level example, because I think sometimes, you know, we talked a lot earlier about level 1, level 2, but what about our level 3, level 4 teachers? So I think about a unit where I might want to be talking about future plans, what my life is going to look like after high school. So thinking backwards here, I'm thinking, all right, what I can have a conversation about what my life will be like. I'm going to need some sort of future tense in order to be able to have that conversation. So if I think about what an early unit task might look like, I want to provide some sort of reason why kids would talk to each other and learn about each other's future plans. So what I might do is I might create some sort of context where they want to learn about each other. And so I might provide them with a list of possible answers and say, which of these things are actually logical for your future? What do you actually want to do, like, after graduation? Are you going to live in a city? Are you going to have 12 dogs? Like, what's your plan? And so writing out all of those answers out for kids and having a list where I give them the forms. So that would be all in the I form. I will do this. I will do that. And then providing them with some questions that they can go around and interview other students with. Oh, in your future, will you live in a city? And so I'm giving them the forms that are in that you form. And then we have some sort of synthesizing activity afterwards where we say, all right, let's compare and contrast. Maybe the task the entire time was, do you think that the two of you would be good roommates? Maybe that's the whole purpose of why we're talking. So, okay, we both, you want to live in the city. I don't want to live in the city. So I might do some sort of writing where I communicate back to my partner, yeah, this isn't meant to be. Or we're a match made. This is absolutely the way it's supposed to be. So the scaffold built in there. The scaffold is I'm giving them the forms. They have the questions. And I'm pushing kids to say, can you come up with a question of your own if you're ready for it? Now then, if we go to the middle of the unit, we've done more things involving content. We've seen more examples of future tense, but maybe this is the place where I can kind of take a little bit of the scaffolding away and add a little bit more content, add a little bit more vocabulary to it, add a little bit more, maybe there's some cultural pieces I can also add in there as well. So thinking about, for example, in the middle of the unit, let's say we explore a bunch of different options for how to take a gap year and what you can do during a gap year. So we're providing some input right away. We're exploring, let's say there's 5 or 6 different things you can do. And then that leads them to a conversation where it's, all right, if you have to participate in one of these, which one will you do? Why will you do it? What will you do while you're there? Talk to each other about that. Figure out which one might be the best for your partner or which one's the worst for your partner. I like to sometimes throw the worst in there because it really gets them motivated when they're very much against something. And then again, I might have an expressions list. I might have certain verbs for them that is on a piece of paper that I might even flip over and leave on the table and say, it's here if you need it. If you don't need it, don't go for it. If you think you need it, no shame, go for it. But have that quick moment of, I'm still relying on this more than I think I should. And then so at the end of the unit, I might have a simple task of just predicting where do you think your partner will be in 30 years. And so they'll start by making a list of where they think a list of ideas, where will I be? Again, no scaffold. I'm not providing them the verbs. I'm not providing them any structure for that whatsoever. I say you're going to have a conversation with each other, and your goal is to figure out if your predictions are right or wrong, figure out where they're going to be. And then the follow-up task might be write a little note of encouragement to the person and say all right, you can do this. This is your plan. This is what you want to do. And so at that point of the unit, it's the end. I want to see what they can independently do. So there's no scaffolds. There's nothing there. And me as the teacher, I'm only intervening for those little moments.
So I don't want to go down too much of the rabbit hole here, but in case teachers want to learn more about it, what you just described, was that your whole gradual release?
So there's so many different fun things embedded in all of these. It is gradual release in there as well. So we're talking about gradual release of saying, all right, I do, we do, you do. There's talks about student agency. There's talks about scaffolding. There's talks about feedback and what that looks like. All sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, so I just want to plant that seed so teachers maybe they want to go and look more into the book now. So there's this whole process that's also talked about. And as you were explaining that, I almost picked up the book. I was like, I want to find the chapter. I was like, no, we just can't. That's another episode. That's another episode. We can't do all of that type thing. I want to just ask one quick assessment question before we kind of move on from that. And this goes back to something you said earlier, Catherine, when you talked about the expected performance or proficiency level, the output of the student. And you said sometimes, but not always.
Yes.
And you threw that caveat in as you were talking about it. And so for teachers who have this level 2, this level 3 class, like how do we wrap our brains around like the proficiency levels and the performance level? Because you're going to have students that always do it. And then you have some that do it sometimes, but not always. So in terms of assessment, where should we target our performance assessments in our classroom?
For performances, I find just looking at the major proficiency level, as it's called, more helpful than trying to determine, is this performance assessment intermediate low, intermediate mid, intermediate high? So what I mean is, if I have a class where my proficiency target, that's their independent level, is a novice high, year 1, or even intermediate low, year 2, the performances I'm trying to elicit from kids in the classroom tasks and in the assessments would be in the intermediate bucket. So again, that's the simple sentences, questions, et cetera, all that stuff. So I'm really just looking that they're able to use language in that way in relation to the theme and the function that we've been talking about. I'm asking them to describe or explain or whatever it is on this theme at this sort of intermediate major level. I don't feel super hung up on whether it's a low, a mid, or a high for a performance, to be totally honest with you. I just want to see that they can do that. And that's going to help build the independent proficiency level that will progress from a novice high to an intermediate low to all of the sub-levels. I think we get too
Yeah.
hung up on that.
I just wanted to bring the idea of assessment in there because I know
Yeah.
that's what teachers are thinking about. How do you then assess all of this? What does it look
Right.
like? I have to give a letter grade. I have to give a number
Yeah.
grade. And I know that that's a much more robust conversation.
I'll give a quick plug though that we specifically have a chapter where we're like, what about my grammar quiz? Like, what about the verb fill in? What do I do? And we provide specific alternatives. Because for us, like, I think it's felt frustrating that like we haven't had a clear roadmap for like, well, what else am I supposed to do? Like, this is how we've always done it. What else am I supposed to do? So we really do try to have like concrete, specific examples in there. And that's one of them. We were like, what are the big questions we hear? And people were like, well, what about my grammar quiz? What do I do with that? And we give you some alternatives in the book.
For teachers that are having these grappling questions about what they should do, Catherine, I'll just stick with you and I'll say, so for teachers who are primarily used to that traditional grammar instruction, what first steps would you recommend if they want to make this shift towards a proficiency-based approach? And before you even give those recommendations, can you quickly tell us why we should do that? I mean, let's just call it out, right? That's everyone's thinking. It's like, why should I do this? So make a little case for why.
Yeah, why should I? Well, okay, there's many reasons. So I've highlighted some of it, right? Like supporting all learners, like the evidence we do have about learner outcome. But I'm going to just say one more. It's so much more fun. It's way more interesting. It's more engaging. You have more fun and your kids have more fun. So there's many reasons why I would encourage people to make this shift, but that's one that I experience and have heard from so many people. I was one teacher I was chatting with, there was someone, I forget, somebody that just was trying to make them go back to textbooks. And he was literally like, I will quit if I have to go back to the grammar driven. I will quit. I can't do it again. It's so much more fun this way. I won't do it. So that's one more reason to give it a shot, but many others. Okay, here's what I think might be the easiest starting point. Mike mentioned sort of that output piece with a sort of progression across the unit. I think something that we talk about in the book that I think is actually very accessible and teachers might already be doing and not realizing that they're doing is presenting the vocabulary and grammar, kind of marrying them and presenting them at the beginning of the unit. So if the traditional grammar-driven approach is like, let me present the rule to you, and then you practice it. So that's this presentation practice approach. We're asking you to like put that aside, think about, okay, what is the vocab in the unit? What are the structures that they need? What's that grammar? And maybe put it together when you're presenting the vocabulary at the beginning of the unit. You can use visuals. You're going to do this fully in the target language. And we walk through this in this book. And if you still need support with target language use, I would refer you to the first proficiency-based book on input and interaction, because we go in like deep detail about how to do that. But so think about your next unit. What's the vocab? What's the grammar? How can I put them together and maybe have like a little story I'm going to tell kids that like gets them going? So I have like a super silly example that I use when I do workshops sometimes where I talk about myself, and I'm a very picky eater. So I'll walk through like fruit that I don't like, that I do like and don't like. And I present it totally in French, and there's checks for comprehension. There's visual support. I do crazy weird body language to act it out. And the target grammar is like, I like and I don't like, right? So saying preferences. And the vocabulary is the fruit. Like this is a really simple example, but it works to kind of make the point on how to do this. And then I do an like a formative check for learning at the end. And everybody understands what I have said, and they can identify a few things that I'm weirdly picky about with fruit. And so that's something I think you can work on that first lesson, look at your next unit, and put that together and just give it a shot and see how kids do. I think it's an accessible entry point. And then, once you get going with that and feel comfortable, I think you can just build off of that.
So I'm sure that if teachers are new to this concept, this is going to be an episode they have to listen to once, twice, 3 times, and then spend some time in your book. And for those teachers who are down this road already, I'm sure they're getting some reassurance and some new ideas. So that's wonderful. Are there any additional recommendations that you would have for teachers? I definitely think they should check out Proficiency-Based Instruction, Teaching Grammar for Proficiency by Catherine Ritz and Mike Travers. Absolutely. But are there any other recommendations that you might have?
I mean, I think Catherine and I both are going to agree on this one in terms of go to your local state conference, go to NECTFL, go to ACTFL, and try things out. Like, kids are actually pretty forgiving when you want to try these things out. I remember one class in particular. I will never forget them. I came from a workshop it started with 90% target language, and then the next series and that was talking about grammar. And I remember being like, I'm going to try this out with you guys, because they were just that group. And I think that going to different conferences, talking to different teachers, gathering these strategies and trying things out, you'll find that kids are actually more forgiving and actually are a lot more resilient than I think we might realize. They're more willing. This is what they want to do. This is like what's going to help them the most for this. And that's how I got started on this whole crazy fun journey that I'm on. And I wouldn't have traded it for anything.
I totally agree. Conferences, find your group, find your people that can work with you on this, whether they're in your own school or elsewhere. But I would add also, baby step it, right? Baby step to using the target language, baby step to like marrying the vocab and the grammar, baby step to like maybe trying a performance assessment. So keep moving things forward. I love the expression, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's no such thing as perfect teaching. We're all learning. We're all on a journey. So just let yourself take a couple steps forward and see how it goes. And again, it's super fun. And I think the rewards are many.
And you never know, your person might end up being your co-author.
Hey, you never know. You never know. So how can our listeners be connecting with you? Mike, I'll start with you. If we want to reach out to you and talk all things grammar, how can we be doing that?
I mean, clearly I don't enjoy talking about this, but I mean, if you really want to start that, I'm on different social media platforms. I'm on whatever's remaining of Twitter X situation, but I'm on Blue Sky as well. I also have a blog. It's madlanguageteacher.weebly.com. So feel free. I have lots of different examples of grammar up there, and you can reach out, and I'm always happy to talk more about this.
Excellent. I'll make sure all of that is in the show notes. And how about you, Catherine?
Yes, I'm at Ritz World Lang on Blue Sky and Instagram. And I do have a website also, catherineritz.org. So, but yeah, you can usually find us at any of at MAFLA in Massachusetts, NECTFL, ACTFL. Yeah, we'll be around.
Excellent. Wonderful. So I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice, and you've given us so much already, but if you could dig deep, and I know that the last part of your book is actually about sort of the take a deep breath kind of advice. So Mike, can you leave us with a hearty piece of advice?
I'm just going to reiterate what I said from before. Try things. Just give it a try. Don't be afraid. You can try these types of things. And if they fail, try it again. I think the second time around makes you really realize some things.
I know we're facing a lot of challenges as teachers and also as world language teachers, but I also think it's really exciting what's happening in our profession. And I think it's something, you want to be a part of. This is really like groundbreaking and exciting. And we see the payoffs in the kids. And yeah, I just invite you to be part of it. It's worth it.
Thank you so much for being here and contributing to the greater good of the proficiency of teachers. It's been a blast.
Thank you
so much for having us. This has been really exciting.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Catherine Ritz and Mike Travers? I hope that you're seeing the place that grammar has in a proficiency-based classroom and how to go about teaching it more effectively. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Catherine Ritz and Mike Travers. There's also a link to get your own copy of Proficiency-Based Instruction, Teaching Grammar for Proficiency, their new book that they just published. And ACTFL is offering you a 15% discount with the code ACTFL15OFF, and it's all caps. So ACTFL15OFF, all one word, all caps. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter for tips and resources for language teaching. And there are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And remember, we can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.